The morning they cast Sylvie Navarro from the only home she'd ever known, wildflowers bloomed defiantly through the cracks in the church steps, as if nature herself was taking sides. You can almost smell the dust settling in the wake of Reverend Trenton's black carriage as it disappeared down the rutted road, leaving nothing but wheel marks and whispered judgments. The good people of Cedar Ridge had made their decision. Sylvie stood on the porch of the boarding house, her few belongings clutched in a flour sack, watching the town that raised her turn its collective back. Shameful, Mrs. Harmon had hissed through her teeth just an hour before. Dancing with that traveling preacher's son like some common. Well, I won't say the word in the Lord's house. But Sylvie had said plenty of words. Words that made the church ladies clutch their pearls and the menfolk shuffle their boots. Words about freedom and choice and the right to feel music in your bones without asking permission. Words that sealed her fate faster than a coffin nail. The memory burned fresh as yesterday's brand. She'd been cleaning the church after Sunday service when the fiddle music drifted through the open windows from the harvest dance. Her feet had moved of their own accord, swaying to the melody that called to something wild in her soul. When Royce Trenton, the Reverend's own nephew, appeared in the doorway with that crooked smile and extended hand, she'd taken it without thinking. They danced right there between the pews, spinning and laughing while moonlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting them in colors of sin and salvation. The music had filled every corner of that sacred space, and for those precious moments, Sylvie had felt more alive than all her 22 years combined, until Reverend Trenton found them. The morning sun beat down merciless as August always was, turning the boarding house porch into a skillet. Thea Harmon, the Reverend's sister, emerged with a glass of buttermilk that sweated in the heat. Her face bore the weathered kindness of someone who'd seen enough of life to know judgment was a luxury few could afford. "Drink this." Thea's voice carried none of the venom her brother had wielded from the pulpit. "Road to Deadwood's long and unforgiving. You think I'm making a mistake." Sylvie took the glass, surprised by the kindness. The buttermilk was cool against her parched throat, tasting of better days when the world seemed wider and more forgiving. "I think you're 22 and got more fire than this dried-up town knows what to do with." Thea's weathered hands smoothed her apron, fingers tracing patterns of worry into the faded fabric. "Question is, what you aim to do with all that flame? Let it burn you up, or use it to light your way?" The words settled deep, stirring something fierce in Sylvie's chest. Before she could answer, the thunder of hooves announced a rider approaching. Fast. The horse was a paint stallion, black and white like storm clouds, and the man astride it sat tall in his saddle with the easy confidence of someone who'd never asked the world for permission to exist. Gideon Rowe reined in his mount with a gentle word, dismounting with fluid grace. His hat shadowed eyes the color of summer lightning, and when he swept it off in greeting, dark hair caught the morning light like polished obsidian. Everything about him spoke of open horizons and untamed spaces, from the worn leather of his chaps to the careful way he moved, like a man always ready for whatever trouble might come calling. "Ma'am." He nodded to Thea, then turned those storm-gray eyes on Sylvie. "Mississippi couldn't help but notice you look like someone fixing to travel." Sylvie straightened, chin lifting with that stubborn pride that got her in trouble. The same pride that had made her dance in the sanctuary. Consequences be damned. "And what business might that be of yours, stranger?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, but appreciative, like he recognized a kindred spirit. "None at all, I reckon. 'Cept I heard tell in town about a young lady who gave the good Reverend a piece of her mind about freedom and dancing and such. Figured anyone with that much backbone might appreciate knowing the trail ahead." Heat flooded Sylvie's cheeks. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge, especially the scandalous kind. The trail ahead? Thea stepped closer, protective instincts sharpening her voice like a blade against a whetstone. "What trail would that be, Mr. Rowe?" "Gideon Rowe. And I'm speaking of the road to Deadwood. 3 days hard riding through some of the most unforgiving country God ever carved." His gaze never left Sylvie's face, measuring her reaction. "Apache been moving through the passes, and the Tanner gang's been hitting supply wagons regular. Not to mention the heat'll cook a body if they ain't prepared proper." Sylvie felt something flutter in her chest, part fear, part excitement. The same feeling she'd had when the music called to her feet that fateful night. You trying to scare me back into that church pew, cowboy? No, ma'am. His voice carried the rumble of distant thunder, promising storms and cleansing rain. I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to dance wherever you please. The words hung in the still air like smoke from a campfire. Thea cleared her throat, but Sylvie barely heard her. Something passed between her and this stranger, a recognition like calling to like. Here was someone who understood the music, that lived in wild hearts. I can take care of myself, she said, though the words felt hollow against the vastness of the territory stretching ahead. The desert didn't care about pride or backbone or the fire that burned in a woman's soul. I'm sure you can. Gideon replaced his hat, shadows falling across his features again. But the desert don't care how much backbone you got. It'll kill you just the same, slow and patient as Sunday sermon. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the heated silence like a warning. In the distance, a dust devil spun lazy across the scrubland, picking up tumbleweeds and dreams with equal indifference. The sight reminded Sylvie of her own situation, caught between staying safe and being swept away by forces beyond her control. What you suggesting, Mr. Rowe? Suggesting nothing but the truth. It's dangerous country for anyone traveling alone. He paused, studying her face like he was reading sign on a trail, looking for something that might tell him which way her heart was leaning. But if you're set on going, might be I could use the company. Been riding alone too long myself, and solitude's got a way of making a man forget how to be civilized. Thea made a small sound of protest, but Sylvie was already seeing the possibilities. The chance to leave not as a discarded woman slinking away in shame, but as someone choosing her own path, with a man who looked at her like she was worth protecting, not reforming. I don't even know you, she said, though her heart was already galloping ahead of her good sense like a Mustang scenting freedom. Know me well enough. His eyes held steady on hers, unwavering as the North Star. No, I tipped my hat instead of telling you to get back where you belong. No, I'm offering partnership, not charity. And no, the sun ain't getting any cooler while we stand here jawing about propriety. But as she weighed her options, neither Sylvie nor Thea noticed the figure watching from behind Malachi Shaw's store, someone who'd been tracking Gideon Rowe. For reasons that had nothing to do with protection, the figure behind Malachi Shaw's store stepped deeper into shadow as Sylvie made her decision. Zuri Vaughn had been tracking Gideon Rowe for 3 weeks across 2 territories, and she wasn't about to lose him now, especially not to some wild-eyed girl who didn't know a wolf from a shepherd. Partnership, Sylvie repeated, tasting the word like honey on her tongue. A freight wagon rumbled past on the main road, heading west toward promises and possibilities. The driver touched his hat to the ladies, but didn't slow. Everyone in Cedar Ridge was moving forward except her, frozen on this porch between her old life and whatever lay ahead. Share the journey, share the responsibilities, Gideon explained, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man used to gentling. Skittish horses. You help with camp and cooking, I handle navigation and protection. Fair trade in country where fairness is scarce as water. Sylvie looked back at the town that birthed her, its neat rows of houses and judgment sitting baked under the roofless sun. The church steeple pierced the sky like an accusing finger, reminding her of all the rules she'd broken, all the expectations she'd shattered with her dancing feet and defiant words. Then she looked at Gideon Rowe, this stranger offering something no man ever had: respect for her choices. My horse is in the stable behind Malachi Shaw's store, she heard herself say. Give me 10 minutes to settle my affairs. Thea's urgent whisper stopped her at the door. Child, what do you really know about this man? The question hung heavy as storm clouds, but Sylvie's mind was already made up. She'd danced in the sanctuary knowing full well the consequences. She'd spoken her piece to Reverend Trenton knowing it would cost her everything. What was one more leap into the unknown? I know he's offering me a chance, she said softly, more than anyone else in this town ever has. Inside the boarding house, Sylvie gathered her few remaining possessions with quick, efficient movements. Her mother's silver hairbrush, worn smooth by years of gentle use. The pressed wildflower from her first communion, a daisy she'd picked, because it looked more cheerful than the prescribed lily. A leather-bound journal filled with her thoughts and dreams, words no one in Cedar Ridge would ever understand. As she stuffed these treasures into her saddlebags, memories flooded back. Her mother's voice singing lullabies in Spanish, weaving stories of distant lands where women could dance under stars without shame. Her father's hands teaching her to ride, to shoot, to survive in country that didn't suffer fools or the unprepared. Both gone now these 5 years, leaving her to the mercy of a town that had no mercy for different. From the window, she watched Gideon water his horse at the public trough. His movements were economical, practiced, the actions of a man who'd spent years learning to read the subtle signs of weather, terrain, and trouble. But there was something else, too. A careful watchfulness that spoke of secrets carried like stones in his saddlebags. Behind Shaw's store, Zuri Vaughn checked her weapons with methodical precision. The Colt .45 at her hip, the Derringer in her boot, the knife that had saved her life more times than she cared to count. She'd been a lawwoman for 8 years, tracking desperados across territories that chewed up good intentions and spat out bones. Gideon Rowe was her greatest failure, the one who'd gotten away when her partner died in that godforsaken canyon outside Tucson. Now he was playing protector to some innocent girl, and Zuri couldn't decide if that made him more dangerous or less. Men like Rowe had a way of collecting people the way storms collected lightning, drawing them close just to watch them burn. Sylvie emerged from the boarding house with her gear, moving with the fluid grace of someone raised around horses. Her riding skirt was practical brown wool, her blouse simple cotton, nothing fancy, but everything chosen for durability over decoration. Gideon nodded approval as she approached. Good. You dress for the trail, not for show. He gestured toward the stable. Let's see what you're riding. The mare in the stable was a buckskin with intelligent eyes and solid conformation. Not flashy, but built for endurance, much like her owner. Gideon ran his hands over the horse's legs, checking for soundness, while Sylvie saddled with economical movements that spoke of long experience. She'll do, Gideon pronounced. What's her name? Esperanza. Sylvie tightened the cinch, her voice soft with affection. Hope, in my mother's tongue. Hope's a good thing to carry into the desert. He swung into his own saddle with fluid ease. But preparation's better. We'll ride hard today, make the way station by nightfall. From there, it's 2 days through Apache country to reach Deadwood. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Sylvie felt the weight of watching eyes. Some curious, some disapproving, all of them cataloging this final scandal for future gossip. She sat straighter in her saddle, chin lifted with defiant pride. Let them talk. She was done caring what small minds thought of big dreams. The trail stretched ahead like a promise written in dust and stone. Gideon set an easy pace, his paint stallion moving with ground-covering efficiency while Esperanza settled into the rhythm beside him. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a brand, but the wind carried sense of sage and possibility. Tell me about Deadwood, Sylvie said when the silence between them had grown comfortable rather than awkward. Growing town. Gold brought the miners, but it's commerce that'll keep it alive. Gideon's eyes scanned the horizon constantly, reading sign in the landscape that remained invisible to her untrained gaze. Place for someone with skill and determination to make a fresh start. And what skills might those be? Well, you can ride and you ain't afraid of hard work. Already puts you ahead of half the folks who drift through. A smile tugged at his mouth. Question is, what do you want to do with that fresh start? Before Sylvie could answer, movement on a ridge caught her attention. A lone rider, keeping pace with them but staying distant. Her pulse quickened with instinctive alarm. We're being followed, she said quietly. Gideon's hand drifted toward his gun without seeming to move at all. I know. Been tracking us since we left town. Apache. Worse. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Gideon Rowe looked genuinely worried. Someone from my past, I'd wager. Someone I'd hoped never to see again. The rider on the ridge raised a spyglass, and sunlight flashed off the lens like a signal, or a warning of storms yet to come. The way station squatted against the desert like a scarred beetle, its adobe walls pocked with bullet holes that told stories no one wanted to hear twice. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising hot food and questionable company. Gideon reined in his paint 50 yards out, studying the corral where a dozen horses stood hipshot in the shade. Crowded for midweek, he murmured, eyes cataloging each mount with the attention of a man who'd learned that details kept you breathing. Could be trouble, could be just travelers seeking shelter from the heat. Sylvie wiped dust from her face with the back of her hand, grateful for even the promise of shade. The afternoon sun had turned the landscape into a furnace and esperanzas. Coat was dark with sweat despite their steady but careful pace. "What kind of trouble you expecting?" Before Gideon could answer, a woman stepped from the station's shadow. Tall and lean as a whip, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of winter sky. A badge caught the late sunlight on her vest, and the Colt at her hip hung with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Gideon Rowe." Her voice carried across the distance like the crack of breaking ice. "Been a long time." Gideon's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady. "Zuri Vaughn. Should have known you'd track me down eventually. You always were persistent as a tick on a hound." Sylvie's gaze flicked between them, reading the current of old history that ran deep and dangerous as flash flood water. The way Zuri's hand rested near her weapon, the careful distance Gideon maintained. This wasn't a friendly reunion. Persistent enough to follow you 3 weeks through country that'd kill most folks. Zuri stepped closer, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each deliberate step. "Question is, why you running with innocent company now? Getting soft in your old age?" "Maybe I just got tired of running alone." Gideon dismounted slow and easy, keeping his hands visible. "And maybe the lady deserves to know what she's gotten herself into." Sylvie felt ice form in her stomach despite the desert heat. "What's she talking about, Gideon?" "Your protector there." Zuri's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. "Is wanted for murder in Arizona territory. Shot down a deputy U.S. Marshal named Frank Morrison in cold blood outside Tucson. I was Morrison's partner. Been hunting this son of a bitch ever since." The words hit Sylvie like a physical blow. She looked at Gideon, really looked, seeing him suddenly as a stranger wearing a familiar face. The careful way he moved, the constant watching, the secrets that flickered behind those storm-gray eyes. Everything that had seemed protective now felt predatory. "That true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon's jaw worked like he was chewing bitter root. "It's true I shot Frank Morrison. But not the way she tells it. Self-defense, I suppose." Zuri's voice dripped contempt. "Just like it was self-defense. When you robbed that bank in Phoenix. And when you gunned down those 3 men in Santa Fe. Bank in Phoenix was robbed by the Tanner gang, and you know it." Heat flared in Gideon's voice for the first time since Sylvie had known him. "As for Santa Fe, those men were fixing to string up an innocent Apache boy for something he didn't do. Sometimes a man's got to choose between law and justice. And sometimes a man's just a killer looking for excuses." Zuri drew her weapon with fluid precision, keeping it trained on Gideon's chest. "Miss, you'd best step away from him. This ends here." Sylvie's mind raced like a spooked Mustang. Everything she thought she knew about this man was crumbling like sun-baked adobe. Yet something in her rebelled against accepting Zuri's version whole cloth. The Gideon she'd ridden with for half a day had shown her nothing but respect and consideration. Could a cold-blooded killer fake such genuine kindness? "What happened in Tucson?" she heard herself ask. "The real story." Gideon's eyes found hers, and she saw pain there, old and deep as canyon shadows. "Morrison and I were tracking the Tanner gang to their hideout in Devil's Canyon. But Frank had been taking money to tip them off about raids. When I confronted him with the evidence, he drew on me. Lies." Zuri's gun never wavered. "Frank Morrison was the finest lawman I ever knew. Honest as summer daylight. Honest men don't have $3,000 in stolen bank notes hidden in their saddlebags." Gideon's voice carried the weight of bitter memory. "Money that matched the serial numbers from the Phoenix robbery. I tried to bring him in alive. Zuri, you got to believe that. But he wouldn't surrender, and he wouldn't let me expose his connection to the gang." For a heartbeat, uncertainty flickered across Zuri's features. Then her jaw hardened again. "Even if that were true, and it ain't, you had no right to be judge and jury. That's what courts are for. Courts are for towns with law and order. Out here, sometimes a man's conscience is the only court he's got." Gideon took a careful step sideways, angling himself between Sylvie and Zuri's gun. "Besides, you know the Tanners would never let Morrison live to testify. I saved the territory a trial and the taxpayers some money." A new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Well, Gideon Rowe and the famous Marshall Vaughn. This is turning into quite the reunion. They all turn to see a lean man emerge from the way station, thumbs hooked in his gun belt with studied casualness. Malachi Shaw, the storekeeper from Cedar Ridge, but something in his eyes had changed, a predatory gleam that hadn't been there when he'd sold Sylvie supplies that morning. Shaw. Sylvie's voice cracked with confusion. What are you doing here? Same thing as everyone else, I reckon. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Waiting for the right moment to collect on Gideon Rowe. See, there's a bounty on his head, $5,000, dead or alive. That's enough money to change a man's circumstances considerable. Behind him, 3 more figures stepped into view. Hard-faced men with the look of hired guns, their weapons already drawn. The afternoon had gone from tense to deadly in the span of a heartbeat. Seems like everyone's got business with you, Rowe, one of the gunmen drawled. Popular fellow. Sylvie found herself caught in the middle of a deadly triangle. Zuri with her badge and her certainty, Shaw with his greed and his hired guns, and Gideon with his secrets and his past. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust devils between them like nature's own omen. And in that moment of balanced tension, when one wrong word could turn the desert red with blood, Sylvie realized that her choice of traveling companion might just get them all killed, or force her to discover what she was truly made of. The desert held its breath like a congregation before the final hymn. 5 guns trained on one man, while the 6th person, Sylvie, stood in the crossfire with nothing but her own racing heartbeat and the weight of impossible choices. $5,000, Shaw repeated, savoring the words like fine whiskey. That's more money than most folks in Cedar Ridge see in a lifetime. All for one manhunter who's finally run out of places to hide. Gideon's hand hovered near his Colt, but even Sylvie could see the mathematics of death stacked against him. 3 hired guns plus Shaw plus Zuri's badge and righteousness. Those weren't odds any sane man would take. Sylvie. His voice was steady as bedrock, though sweat beaded his forehead despite the evening cool settling over the desert. Walk away. This ain't your fight. Like hell it isn't. The word surprised her as much as everyone else. Where had that steel come from? Same place as the courage to dance in the sanctuary, perhaps, or the defiance that had gotten her cast out of the only home she'd ever known. I chose to ride with you, Gideon Rowe. That choice doesn't end just because the trail got dangerous. Shaw laughed, but there was no humor in it. Touching loyalty, miss, but misplaced. Your protector, there has blood on his hands and a price on his head. Smart thing would be to step aside and let justice take its course. Justice? Sylvie's voice rose with indignation that came from somewhere deeper than fear. What justice is there in 5 men ganging up on one? What justice in shooting down a man who offered partnership instead of demanding subservience? She stepped closer to Gideon, close enough to feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. You want to know what I learned about this man in half a day of riding? He waters his horse before himself. He offered me a choice when everyone else demanded compliance. And when that rider started following us, his first thought was protecting me, not saving his own hide. Pretty words. One of Shaw's gunmen sneered. But they won't stop bullets, girlie. Maybe not. Sylvie's hand drifted to the gun at her own hip, a gesture that made every man present reassess her with sudden wariness. But I was raised by a man who taught me that some things are worth dying for. Freedom's one of them. Choice is another. Zuri's expression had gone thoughtful, her gun wavering slightly. You really believe he's innocent? I believe he's more honest than any of you. Sylvie's eyes blazed with conviction that surprised even her. A guilty man would have taken what he wanted and left me in the dust. An innocent man offers partnership and warns about the dangers ahead. The standoff stretched taut as a piano wire. Then, from the way station behind them, came the sound of a window opening. Every head turned to see the barrel of a rifle emerge, followed by a weathered face that surveyed the scene with shrewd intelligence. Y'all might want to reconsider this particular entertainment. The station keeper's voice carried the authority of a man who'd survived decades in country that killed the weak and stupid. See, I got word this morning that the Tanner gang hit a supply train 20 miles south of here. They're riding north, with half the territory's cavalry on their tails. Shaw's confidence flickered. What's that got to do with anything, old man? Means in about an hour. This station's going to be crawling with desperate men looking for fresh horses and shelter. Might be wise to save your bullets for them instead of wasting them on each other. As if summoned by his words, the thunder of approaching hooves rolled across the desert like distant storm. Too many horses, moving too fast, coming from the south, where trouble always seemed to breed like flies on carrion. Tanner gang, Gideon said quietly, his attention split between the approaching riders and the gun still trained on him. 12 men, all of them killers. They won't hesitate to gun down anyone who gets between them and freedom. Shaw's hired. Men exchanged nervous glances. $5,000 was good money, but you couldn't spend it if you were dead. The approaching riders were still distant, but closing fast enough to raise a dust cloud that painted the evening sky the color of dried blood. We could settle this after, one of the gunmen suggested, his bravado evaporating like morning dew. Deal with the immediate threat, then sort out the bounty. No. Zuri's voice cut through the gathering dusk like a judge's gavel. If those are the Tanners, then Gideon might be the only thing standing between us and a massacre. I've seen what they do to witnesses. She holstered her weapon with deliberate precision. I'm not saying I believe your story about Morrison, but I'm willing to postpone justice long enough to survive the night. Shaw's face flushed with frustrated greed. That bounty will still be there tomorrow, Zuri snapped. Assuming we live to see tomorrow. Those riders aren't coming for tea and conversation. The station keeper spat tobacco juice into the dust. Smart lady. Tanners don't take prisoners, and they don't leave witnesses. Best chance any of us got is to work together until they move on. Gideon slowly relaxed his gun hand, though his eyes remained watchful. Sylvie, get inside. Whatever happens next, you don't want to be caught in the open. I already told you, this isn't about choice anymore. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. It's about survival. Those men riding toward us would sell their own mothers for ammunition money. They won't hesitate to do worse to a woman who gets in their way. The dust cloud was close enough now to make out individual riders. 12 men, as Gideon had predicted, their horses lathered with sweat and desperation. They rode with the careless urgency of men who knew pursuit was close behind. Shaw grabbed his men by the arms, pulling them toward the station. Inside, we'll ford up and wait for them to pass. But even as they moved, Sylvie could see the truth in Gideon's eyes. The Tanner gang wouldn't just pass by a way station. They'd need fresh horses, supplies, maybe hostages to slow down their pursuers. And they'd kill anyone who stood in their way. As the first gunshots rang out across the desert twilight, Sylvie realized that dancing in a sanctuary had been child's play compared to the deadly ballet now beginning, one where the music was gunfire. And the only prize was staying alive until dawn. The Tanner gang hit the way station like a prairie fire, fast, vicious, and consuming everything in its path. Led Tanner himself rode point, a scarred bear of a man whose reputation for cruelty stretched across 3 territories. Behind him came his brothers and their collection of killers, men who'd chosen bullets over honest work and found themselves good at it. Fresh horses, Tanner bellowed as his gang surrounded the station. Supplies and information. Give us what we need, and maybe some of you live to see sunrise. Inside the adobe walls, 7 people pressed against windows and door frames, watching death approach on lathered horses. The station keeper, Old Pete, as he'd introduced himself, checked his rifle with practiced calm. They'll want the horses first, Gideon whispered, positioning himself where he could cover both the front door and the window facing the corral. Then they'll come for supplies. Question is whether they decide we're worth keeping alive or just obstacles to remove. Sylvie crouched beside him, her own gun drawn though her hands trembled slightly. The weight of the Colt seemed heavier now, pregnant with possibility and consequence. How many times you faced odds like this? Too many. His eyes never left the window. But never with someone I cared about getting caught in the crossfire. The admission hung between them like smoke from a campfire, warming something in Sylvie's chest despite the terror crawling up her spine. Before she could respond, Tanner's voice boomed across the compound again. I know you're in there. Send out the women, and we'll make this quick and clean. Keep hiding, and we'll burn you out like rats in a granary. Zuri moved to a position covering the back door, her badge meaning nothing now except as target practice for men who'd already killed. 2 federal marshals. They're not bluffing about the burning. Tanners leave nothing but ash and bones. Shaw huddled with his hired guns near the fireplace. Their earlier bravado evaporated like morning mist. $5,000 seemed like pocket change when weighed against immediate survival. Maybe we should give them what they want, he whispered. Hand over Roe and the woman. Buy ourselves some breathing room. You try it. Old Pete's rifle swung toward Shaw with casual menace. And I'll put a bullet in you myself. Been running this station for 20 years, and I never yet sold out. Guessed for my own hide. Outside, the gang was spreading out, surrounding the station with military precision. These weren't drunken cowboys or desperate greenhorns. They moved like seasoned fighters who'd learned their trade in the bloodiest corners of the frontier. There, positioning for an assault, Gideon observed quietly. Pete, you got to back way out of here. Root cellar connects to a wash about 50 yards north. But it's a crawl through darkness, and if they spot you coming out. The old man shrugged eloquently. Better than waiting here to be roasted. Gideon turned to Sylvie, his storm gray eyes intense with urgency. You're going through that cellar. Get to your horse and ride hard for the cavalry patrol. They can't be more than an hour behind the gang. Not without you. The words came out stronger than she felt, backed by the same stubborn courage that had made her dance when dancing was forbidden. I told you before, I chose this trail. That choice doesn't end when the shooting starts. Before Gideon could argue, gunfire erupted outside. Not random shots, but deliberate targeting. The Tanners were killing the station's horses to prevent escape. Each shot rang like a death knell, closing off another avenue of retreat. Esperanza, Sylvie breathed, thinking of her buckskin mare. She's in the wash, Pete said quickly. Moved her there when I saw trouble coming. Old habit from my cavalry days. Always keep an escape route clear. The front door exploded inward under a shotgun blast, and chaos flooded the station like flash. Flood water. Led Tanner himself charged through the smoking doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the desert twilight. Behind him came his brothers, Colt and Remington Tanner, named for their parents' favorite weapons, and living up to those names every bloody day. Gideon's first shot took Colt Tanner center mass, spinning him around like a child's top. But there was no time to admire marksmanship. Remington's return fire splintered the window frame inches from Sylvie's head, showering her with adobe fragments. Zuri's gun barked from the rear, dropping one of the gang members trying to circle around back. Old Pete's rifle boomed like thunder, and another outlaw pitched forward into the dust. But for every man they dropped, another seemed to take his place. The cellar. Gideon shouted over the gunfire. Now! But Sylvie was already moving, not toward the cellar, but toward the front of the station where Lead Tanner was reloading behind an overturned table. The big man's attention was focused on Gideon, and he never saw the wild-eyed girl with her mother's Spanish blood and her father's frontier steel. Her first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around with a roar of pain and rage. Her second shot went wide as his return fire forced her to dive for cover. But those precious seconds of distraction allowed Gideon to angle for a clean shot. Lead Tanner dropped like a felled oak, and suddenly the heart went out of the gang's assault. These were men who followed strength, and with their leader bleeding out in the dirt, they lost the cohesion that made them dangerous. Boss is down, someone shouted from outside. Fall back to the horses. The surviving gang members melted away into the gathering darkness, leaving their dead and wounded behind. In the space of 5 violent minutes, the station had gone from besieged fortress to charnel house. The air thick with gun smoke and the copper scent of blood. Sylvie found herself sitting in the dust, her gun still smoking in her hand, staring at Lead Tanner's still form. She'd killed a man. The knowledge sat heavy in her stomach, but alongside the nausea came something else, a fierce satisfaction that she'd protected the people who mattered to her. Gideon knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he checked for wounds. You hit. No. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. But I shot him. I killed a man. You saved lives. His fingers tilted her chin up until their eyes met. Including mine. Don't you apologize for that. Not ever. Outside, the sound of approaching cavalry grew louder. Salvation arriving just a few minutes too late to matter, but not too late to clean up the aftermath. Zuri emerged from the rear of the station, her badge catching the last light of day. Warrants still outstanding, she said quietly, but there was something different in her voice now. but I reckon it can wait another day or two. Maybe long. Enough for me to ask some harder questions about Frank Morrison and his finances. Shaw and his men slipped away in the confusion, greed momentarily overcome by the reality of violence. Some fights weren't worth the money, and they learned which side of that line they fell on. As the cavalry arrived to secure the scene, Sylvie and Gideon sat on the station porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new choices, new roads to travel. But tonight, they were alive and together, having faced the worst the frontier could offer and emerged with their souls intact. Still want to see Deadwood? Gideon asked softly. Sylvie smiled, feeling the wild music in her heart that no church or convention could ever silence. Partner, I want to see everything this country has to offer, and I want to see it with you. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the rising moon, and the desert bloomed with night flowering cereus, beautiful and brief as hope itself, but no less precious for its fragility. Well, folks, if that tale of frontier courage and wild hearts stirred something in your soul, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd tip your hat with a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the untamed West, where love and danger dance together under endless skies. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today, whether you're in the heart of Texas, the mountains of Colorado, or clear across the ocean in distant lands. Every voice adds to the chorus of this great wide world we're all sharing.